Hi, everyone. I'm Joshua Barnes, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today. And I do want to start off before I introduce our guest experts today to make an announcement that if you stay to the end, we have a special offer for everyone. So I'd like to introduce Rod Bray and Paul Sims. My tagline for them is setting the standard before there was one. They're both CDACs, Certified Discipline Agile Coaches, Certified Discipline Agile Instructors, a wealth of experience. And I would say you probably can't tell by just looking at the three of us, but we have combined probably close to 100 years of experience. So a special thank you for both of you attending today. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for just a moment and get us into more of a full screen mode here. So today's webinar is a topic that I come across quite a bit, as do Paul and Rod, which is why I invited them here today. It's answering a question of what does good look like. So for me, I typically want to have this question asked by leadership team members when I'm working with supporting, larger scale organizational transformations to an agile way of working and specifically discipline agile. I also am seeing an increasing amount of this type of question being asked in the Discipline Agile Lean Scrum Master training courses that I've been delivering. So a lot of the people we're getting in, PMI ACPs, certified Scrum Masters, even to some degree, some of the people that have experience with SAFe and an SPC certification will ask, well, the equivalent of, well, what does good look like for a team? And then the third thing that I'll add in is it's a question I like to ask. So a lot of times I get engaged to come in and do an assessment for organizations that have maybe been at taking an agile way of working for some time. They've got areas that they feel are doing pretty well, other areas they're not quite sure about. So one of the first things I like to do when I engage with the COE types of resources, right, the more senior agile consultants or agile coaches, as well as the team level coaches, is to ask them, like, what does good look like for you, or what do you feel good is? And so that's today's topic. So yeah, I'd like to open it up to Paul and Rod if you've got anything you want to add in, as this is meant to be just more of the free form type of discussion.
Yeah, let's have a conversation today, and we're excited to be able to share our experience, and thank you for inviting us, Joshua.
Yeah, so one of the things that when I start taking a look at what does good look like, I typically want to break that down into two major components. And if I had to put a weighting from a percentage perspective on it, I would say, a larger percentage, 60-65%, would be, if we're moving to an agile way of working, are we seeing we're in a position to have a higher level of confidence or higher probability we're going to be delivering that next increment of functionality to provide better business value, right? And so some of the things that we'd want to look at there is, are the stakeholders getting involved, right? Are we seeing that very early in the life cycle, we've got functionality that's being developed, being implemented, and at a minimum, we would see during our iteration reviews, if we're using the Agile life cycle out of DA, that the stakeholders are having an opportunity to interact with that functionality, hopefully, prior to the iteration review, but again, at a minimum there. And we should be seeing that there are changes based on their validated feedback, right? I mean, they're providing a much more information than we would get with traditional approaches. And by doing that, we would be able to see, hopefully, that we're going to be moving to a higher level of confidence in the value we're going to be delivering. And then the other component of that is, it's expensive to change the way you're doing your work, right? So whether you're adopting DA or you're adopting something else. So our teams just doing what they've been doing and providing, the equivalent of lip service, is it, agile in name only. And we want to maybe have some mechanisms in place, some ways to measure, are the teams actually adopting an agile way of working? And are they making progress with it? Because training's expensive, bringing in external support, right? Coaches are expensive. New hires, right? If you've got people that you're going to bring in as new employees into your organization. And so we want to make sure we've got some measures from what good looks like.
Yeah, that's so very well said, Joshua. We probably all agree, the three of us would all agree that the goal isn't to be agile. The goal is
Yeah.
to accomplish what the firm, what the company wants, which
Right.
is high value delivered frequently and early, right? I mean, an
Right.
agile promises to do that. Now, so when you ask the question, what does good look like? You know, it's not, well, are our stand-up meetings held to 15 minutes? Uh, you know,
Right.
it's not things like that.
Right.
Though there's this sense, just as there was in traditional ways, that if we do all the different components exactly right, well, then the end result will be good. But it's more complicated than that. You know, it's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
And so in that way, just because you do a good job on some of your iteration planning, you do a good job on this, you do a good job of that, does not necessarily translate into good good could really be, you know. And so we see, I'm sure Paul has seen this, we've both seen, we've all three of us seen a wide range of results. You know, those companies that
Yeah.
seem to get very little, you know, they're pretty happy if they get 5-10% improvement in terms of
Right.
time to market or something like that. And then we see other companies, perhaps we've been directly involved with them, or we've read about them, or we've heard about them from colleagues who achieve hundreds of percent improvement in terms of
Yeah.
how they're delivering value and the improvement in customer satisfaction. So the first thing I would always say when we're talking about what does good look like is to take our eyes necessarily off of the individual practices, what we're doing, and instead try to get some larger sense of, are we delivering value, real value, quickly and regularly? You know, and when you start to hear, you know, as Paul and I did a course here the other day, and someone was telling us about how they're doing agile, and they're feeling pretty good about all the different things they're doing, but they can't figure out why they can't get to doing releases more frequently than every 13 weeks.
The
So,
important thing is to focus on outcomes, right? It's not the
right.
Yes.
output, it's the
Yeah.
outcomes that we're interested in. The other thing that I was thinking as Joshua introduced the topic is the important role that stakeholders play. And I think it behooves teams to spend some time explaining to stakeholders why we are engaging them and set expectations about what do we expect from them. Because without that proper engagement and the valuable stakeholder feedback, we're not necessarily going to maximize the value that we produce as a team.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many missed opportunities when we don't have that type of engagement. I mean, that's one of the reasons why taking an agile way of working is so beneficial.
I often ask the team after an iteration review, did you get what you need in order to move on to the next iteration? Did you receive the feedback that you expected? And if your stakeholders aren't engaged enough, ask the question, what can we do as a team to improve that level of stakeholder engagement, whether it's during the iteration or at the iteration review?
Yeah. And I do have a question. So Brajesh, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is asking if when using discipline agile, uh, if you're choosing your way of working, so by that I'm assuming you mean that, you know, creating your instance of DA, does that mean there's one way to measure what good looks like for all teams? And my answer to that is absolutely no. Part of what we need to be looking at is the context for a given organization, but for the teams themselves. So, right, I mean, what Rod said, I mean, we should be looking at outcomes as a primary measure of what we're doing. And some of that is going to be both within the team and what the team is doing, as well as how they're interacting with other teams, right? So some of the things that we cover in the DALSM, the Discipline Agile Lean Scrum Master training, is that we work with complex adaptive systems and we have teams all over the place. And there are times where we need to be looking at dependencies, things that an agile team is working on that another team is going to be consuming or needing, and vice versa. How well are we doing with those types of aspects also is part of like what good should be looking like, because we've got more concerns than just our individual team from an outcome perspective for a given organization, a lot of times.
So well said. Yeah, every team's a snowflake, right? I mean, they're all
Yeah.
very unique. And
Yeah.
so as a result, there isn't a snapshot of the best practices, the best way of doing things. And, DA very clearly specifies this, that we have a host of very good practices within a context. And so that's what we need to understand is how do we apply, essentially, how do we experiment to find the best way for this to work together? And the one of the problems has been, I think, as a pushback against all this is that there's a desire, and has always been a desire, for certainty. There's a desire to live in a deterministic world, and traditional approaches, plan-based approaches, waterfall approaches, whatever you want to call those, pin all their hopes on that we can get requirements all figured out. Our customers are able to articulate what they need and they won't change their mind. Requirements don't go stale. A whole host of things that try to peg down certainty. But the problem is we live in a stochastic world. And so that just doesn't happen. So we've seen, this is why Agile is such a great answer to the stochastic nature of our world, is that the idea is to always be in a position where we can adapt to change. And the same holds true for our practices. So as we are finding our way through this path of what works for us today may not work for us next month or 6 months or next year. And so we need to be working through a way to continuously improve and adapt. Ideally, using what we like to call in the DA world, guided continuous improvement, where we have experienced coaches, experienced people who are to say, well, this is a great place to start, but you don't want to stay here because we can do better, but we probably can't do better right now because your organization has been perfectly tuned and optimized to operate the way it's currently operating. And when we start to make these big changes, we're going to have all sorts of impedances that will arise. And that causes angst and agita. And ultimately, those things fall on the people. And people, as we all know, are not machinery. We can't just expect this all to just work by lining a whole series of practices and pressing a button. And now we're agile, and now it'll all work better.
Yeah,
we want
the company
teams
over the weekend.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, we want teams to move away from being satisfied with the status quo to craving continuous improvement and recognizing that at any point in time, we can always do better.
Yeah,
the important thing to understand, though, is what is going to give us the most value. What should we focus on? Perhaps one or two things that will make us better in the next iteration or in the next 2 or 3 iterations if it takes time.
Yeah, well said. That is so well said, Paul. It's the moving away from a state of satisfaction. Well, we've arrived. If you believe you've arrived, you're already falling behind, right? In the early days, this will be pretty easy to start applying agile approaches because they're so different. And almost anything will start to work, though there may be some impedances that you can't do this because of the way your organization is structured or the way your people are aligned or the problem space or the technology you're working with or whatever it is. But as you begin to apply those, then just exactly as Paul says, things will start to get better. But when they do, we can't just take our foot off the gas, so to speak. We want to keep this thing going. In the early days, and I've used this expression because I'm an old-time coder. I've been coding since the days of punched cards, if I can actually declare my age.
Go back to that 100 years of experience.
Yeah.
I didn't mean just you, Rod.
No, it's like steam computers, right? I'm telling people about. So back in those days, we used to use this term of code smell, that we would look at our coding and it just wouldn't seem right. And so the metaphor was like, and maybe this never happens in other people's homes, but when I open my fridge, sometimes it doesn't smell right. And in that case, I've got to start to go in and find out what the problem is. And that might take some experimentation and some real digging and looking. And this is the kind of thing that we want to be doing as well when we're working on our processes. In the early days, it'll be pretty easy to uncover that really stinky piece of cheese. But afterwards, it will be harder because we'll be getting to put a pretty fine point on some of this. But we cannot rest. We cannot rest.
I'd like to pick up on something that Rod said about impediments. You know, a team is going to come across things that are slowing their progress or blocking their progress. And some of those things might be outside of the team's control. But I think in the spirit of agility, we need to be very transparent about those things too, and not be afraid to talk about them, whether it be in an iteration review meeting with stakeholders or perhaps with the person who's supporting the team, whether that be a people manager or somebody else in the organization. Don't be content with the way it works today if you think it can be improved.
Yeah, I don't like to introduce lots of different quotes really at any time, but there is one that I try and work into every training session I do, which is from the founder of the Toyota Motor Corporation, which was, if you didn't improve your process every day, you were a salary thief, right? So it can be something really small, right? So yeah, just right on with that point is always trying to make improvements, right? Starting where we're at, regardless of what types of impediments or challenges that we have, because it's never an ideal, or rarely if ever an ideal situation, and continue to make improvements from where we are. So we do have, let's see, we've got a question here, Suhail, and again, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Should we be comparing two teams performing because management always tries to compare them? I'll take a crack at this first, and then definitely, you know, Rod and Paul, you can pile on top. I'd say very similar to where we don't want to get into taking a look at things like velocity and making comparison between teams. No, what good looks like for one team should definitely be different for another team. However, I will tie in one of the things that we teach both in the Foundations of Lean class as well as our Choose Our Way of Working is there are some things that we might identify at a higher level, like an organization level, like are teams able to have smaller and smaller batches of work? Are teams able to identify unplanned work, which we all know when we have teams that are taking an agile way of working and they're pulling work, especially if they're using the agile life cycle and they're going through iteration planning and they're pulling the work that they're going to do, and then they have work thrust upon them. Well, that can cause quite a bit of an impediment. So there are things that we might want to say that all teams, we could have a few things that would be beneficial that we could measure. But outside of that, no, teams should be basing what good looks like for them.
I think teams need to be aware of the value that they're delivering, and that should be the conversation. Not that our velocity is lower, but the value we are delivering is improving. And again, we shouldn't be looking at it at a point in time. We should be looking at it over time and see what the trend is of the team. Because if the team is improving, then I think that is good enough. From my point of view, right? The team is on the right path.
Yeah, very well said, guys. I haven't got anything to add to either what you two have just said. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, then I've got another question, and before I try and crack at answering it, I'm going to leave it to you two first. So this is from Kurt, and the question is, what industries are you sensing will be most ready and ripe for agile transformation? Sorry, the chat box just jumped. And a follow-up, do you anticipate appetite for real change will be strong post-COVID? And a follow-up, are you changing your approach, engagement model, and working with these groups in light of market conditions, working from home challenges, et cetera?
So the first question made me think, so which industry is ripe for disruption at this point in time? Can you just repeat the question? Because I want to make sure I'm answering it correctly.
What industries are you sensing will be most ready and ripe for agile transformation? Is that different than what you are seeing pre-pandemic? So I'll leave that first part before I answer, or before I go to the second part.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of that question, I think of industries that have a very long running processes that are working in large batches today that aren't thinking about delivering value incrementally and iteratively. So maybe there are some industries that have to naturally be that way, like aerospace. But I think there are others where the disruption is on the horizon. I think of the insurance industry, for example, and the potential there that uh, an insurance provider comes out of nowhere, so to speak, and offers a product that the big insurance companies that use traditional processes are going to find hard to respond to.
Yeah, very well said, Paul. I would characterize it that way rather than try to identify an individual industry. Think in terms of which ones will be most disrupted by what's going on. One of the things we're seeing obviously is retail. Retail is being highly disrupted, right, by what's going on here. And we've seen lots of companies that had honestly never given a thought to a large amount of their business coming in through an online presence have to spin on a dime to do it. And there will be lots of others. Industries, think about the kinds of stuff that this pandemic is doing in terms of things like travel and tourism and the like. There will be lots of these sorts of things. But I'm probably not going to go out on a limb and try to predict what the industries are. Winston Churchill said very well, it's very hard to predict things, particularly about the future. And so, I'm just not going to go there, but rather pile in on what Paul said, is that if it appears that there's a high level of disruption going on, that is where Agile finds its sweet spot, because we're able to spin. That's what Agile is about, right? There's a misapprehension in lots of people's minds that Agile means faster. And I think we would all agree it doesn't mean faster. It means more resilient to change, that we are able to adapt. That's what Agile means. And so those areas where we need this change resiliency, that's where we'll find a large uptake in Agile going forward.
And I think governments have learned a lot over the past few weeks as well, right? And their ability to introduce programs that before COVID-19 would have taken months or years to roll out to a population, but we've been able to do it quickly because that was necessary and that was valuable.
Yeah, and I'll add one other data point. So I had a company that was interested in making some strides to adopt discipline agile way before COVID came about. And, and the mindset was they're very profitable. They're doing little pockets of agile. And it was kind of like, yeah, I mean, no matter what we do, we're okay. And I got contacted by one of the senior leadership team members that said, we're in a bit of trouble and now we need to be more effective. We need to be getting more out of the money we're putting into anything we do. And so I think what we also might see, and I'm really hoping for this opportunity, is that there's maybe more seriousness with some of these agile adoptions where they need to see results and we can tie that to outcomes. There's a few more questions that I'm gonna try and get us to, and I'm gonna tie this into Ahmad. Ahmad asks, so we want method to madness, but just like when we started adopting Agile, people were wanting to be able to deliver good work that the client can accept instead of processes. Now people are again stuck in ceremonies. How can we guard against this losing focus again when adopting DA? It's about outcomes, right?
Exactly.
That's and the whole point of discipline agile in a large part for me is we're choosing our instance of our way of working, and that's always going to be hopefully changing to some degree. So getting stuck by just saying, yes, there's these handful of practices we've selected and we're doing those practices, whether they're the right ones or the most valuable ones, that's not the point.
Right.
Consistency and predictability are important. So I would ask the team, if you make a commitment at the beginning of the iteration, are you keeping your commitment? We want the team to focus on meeting its commitments. And a team is overcommitting, then they have to recognize they don't have that capacity and perhaps they need to scale back and they need to get good at delivering less before they start ramping up to deliver more.
Yes. And another really good question we've got from Jimmy. When thinking about the program lifecycle or a program culture, what does good look like?
Well, I would, it's interesting that Jimmy would bring this up because the last major engagement I was on was with a large financial institution. And it was a program in the sense that there was a group working on, we'll call it an online presence to allow customers to open up accounts, which was amazingly difficult. It had to do with digital signatures and e-consent and routing and all the rest of those things. Well, the technology of actually building an online presence isn't that difficult, but it's obviously time consuming if you've got lots and lots to do. But at the same time, there was another team working in the program that had to do with changing standard operating procedures. And another one had to do with practices and policies of the internal workers and how things were going to be evolving as the software went into place, because obviously the back office is going to change now, but we still have some other needs. Well, they're applying very different ways of working. One's very software based. The other one is kind of knowledge based. Some of it is business unit readiness based, and how they would all work. It would sound like a trite answer and maybe a typical consulting answer, but it depends. They have to do the right thing within their context. If the idea was that the software group is working in these 2-week sprints because they want to stop and assess where they are, and the other groups are doing the same thing, when they might best be served by simply making their work highly visible and working in a flow fashion, like a Kanban board, then it would be a mistake to just mandate that everybody works the same way and this is what good looks like. That's just not the case.
I'd like to quickly answer from a different perspective, because we know that we need to be collaborative. So in a program, is your product ownership team working well together? Is your architecture ownership team working well together? Are your team leads or your scrum masters coordinating the work of the teams? And do you have a program manager in place who can help the teams with those impediments that they're not able to solve themselves?
Very well said. Yeah, it's amazing how much of Agile distills down to work better together.
Yeah, work better together. And that is a I don't want to say a complex question, but we will write some blog entries to kind of cover this in a little bit more depth, Jimmy. And then there's a few more questions that I don't think we're going to have time to get to today. I do have one that I do want to answer from Amog. And like PMI can be used in other industries, can we use other industries such as manufacturing with DA? And I'll say we can, and that is a little bit of a plug for not next week, where we've got a woman named Linda Groke who's going to come and talk about her journey as a senior Scrum Master and getting into the DA toolkit. But our next presentation after that actually is talking about how DA can be used for non-software development, business related, or those types of activities. We do have some new life cycles in DA that focus specifically on those types of initiatives. So I'll probably put a little something in a blog entry on that, Amog, but then we'll actually have a webinar around that. We're getting right at the end of our time. So I do want to announce that this approach to identifying what good looks like is something that we have quite a lot of intellectual property from consulting engagements. And there has been such a request for kind of packaging this up. We've decided to do that. So we do have a new half-day training that we are going to be putting out. And I would like to make the offer for anyone in attendance. If you're interested in coming, send me an email. And not only can you get into one of the initial deliveries, but we'll provide a really nice discount for you to show the appreciation of you attending the webinar today. Or if you're watching this recorded and you're taking the time to watch it as well, send me an email. And in the initial deliveries of this new half-day workshop, which is very exciting. It's something that's intended to not only kind of go into a bit more depth than the three of us covered today, but leave you with something that you have an approach and a strategy and a new tool in your toolkit to be able to do some of this with your team or at your organization. The questions in the Q&A, I see there's still quite a few. We will answer those and put those up. And I'd like to give a really special thanks to Paul and Rod for attending today. And getting some insight into your experience and expertise. Really appreciate.
Well, it's our
Thank you,
pleasure.
Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua.
And yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and we hope to see you at not only the upcoming webinars, but also attending training on identifying what good looks like for you. Thanks, everyone.